Good evening. My name is Patrick Griffin. I direct the Keough-Naughton Institute at Notre Dame. I also teach history at Notre Dame, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to our wonderful Global Gateway here in London. I'm not going to say much today because we have a bit of a packed program. And to kick us off and to offer an appreciation for the person that we're going to be honoring today, I'm delighted to welcome Senya Paseta. Senya is professor of modern history at St. Hugh's College, University of Oxford. She specializes in the political history of modern Ireland and Britain, with a particular interest in the history of feminism, education, and political activism. She has published many things, and one of the most prominent ones would be Irish Nationalist Women, 1900 to 1918. She also, in 2016, edited Uncertain Futures, essays about the Irish past for Roy Foster, which marked Roy's retirement as the Carroll Professor of Irish History at the University of Oxford. The volume consists of more than 20 essays by junior and senior scholars, those whose work was shaped by Roy's seminal contributions, and also those who helped shape Roy's career. We regarded her as the perfect person to offer an appreciation of what this splendid historian has done for the profession. So without further ado, Senya, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction, Patrick. And thanks to all of your colleagues at Notre Dame for organising what is, I think, going to be a wonderful event. And I am really pleased to be here and to speak as a former colleague of Roy's for just over 20 years at Oxford, and also as someone who was lucky enough to have been mentored by him and to have benefited from the enormous effort he put into encouraging early career scholars at Oxford. And there are several people in this room who benefited from that as much as I did, and we are extremely grateful for it. So when you invited me to contribute this morning, I of course immediately accepted with great pleasure. And I think almost all of Roy's former students and colleagues would have done the same, for he really is held in remarkably high esteem and affection by so many of us. All of us would have plenty to say about his scholarship, which has had a profound influence on our own research over the last few decades and also on the broader field. I know the impact of his research and the impact of his mentorship with early career students, because as Patrick said, I edited the Feshrift, which marked Roy's retirement from the Carroll Professorship in Irish History at Oxford. And I heard many stories as we exchanged emails from some of the particularly younger career people about the support that he gave them in so many different ways and across careers. I know that I can still email him anytime and ask him for advice, and I know most of us will feel exactly the same way. He read drafts, many drafts, wrote references, many references, offered suggestions, conversations, but most of all, he encouraged us all to follow our own intellectual paths, and that's quite a rare thing. One of the contributors to the volume said to me, and I'm quoting here, "One of Roy's best qualities is that unlike other powerful professors, he's never set up a school of clones. He's always encouraged people to go their own way." And if you have a look at where many of us have gone and what we've done, we have really across a range of subjects and fields in universities across various parts of the world. His commitment to support all of us reflects his broader commitment to modern Irish history and his good discipline, his good citizenship to the discipline more broadly, as well, of course, because he just is a really generous person who's always interested in hearing about other people's ideas. And I saw this firsthand from when we co-taught undergraduate classes. We always had time for the students, through to examining and supervising PhDs, through to listening to really established scholars. He was always interested in what people had to say. He supervised more than 30 PhD students. All the academics in the room are probably gasping. And who knows how many masters, undergraduate dissertations, and so on. And across a real range from 18th century Republican ideas to immigration, 19th century political history, the revolutionary period, women's history, thank you, Roy. Of course, as well on aspects of Ireland's cultural and literary history. So as this range suggests, Roy Foster is an outstanding historian. It's often said that he is one of the very best of his generation and of any generation, I think. He's been such a prolific writer that I can hardly begin to summarise. I thought I might be able to, but it's not possible to list his many publications. And I say this not to flatter, although I'm always happy to do that, but as a statement of fact, because I actually tried to do it. As editor of the Festschrift, I wanted to add a bibliography, a list of academic achievements. This is a standard thing for these sorts of collections. Then I actually began to try to do it, and I quickly realised that it was beyond me. I just didn't have the time. So we recruited a research assistant to do it in the end, but even with very strict editing, we could only include a portion of his published work. We described it as a bibliography of the major writing of Roy Foster down to 2014. We didn't include all of his publications, lectures, academic awards, prizes, keynote addresses, which are the usual markers of excellence in our field. We just didn't have enough room in the volume. But volume of work is one thing. What is truly remarkable about Roy's output is its quality, of course. Each of his 6 monographs is magnificent in its own way, and each has changed the way we think about key aspects of modern Irish history and about writing history more broadly, and not just Irish history. And each reflects some of his key intellectual preoccupation, which has informed and I think continues to form his work, which is balancing social, cultural forces with political change, the importance of generational and attitudinal shifts, the understanding of Ireland in broader European and world history, and the importance of exploring worlds and imagined futures that almost were and what remained in their place. Roy's friend and colleague, former colleague, Eric Hobsbawm, argued that historians must think in terms of historical change, interaction, and transformation. And this remains, I think, the core task of the historian. Explaining change across time might seem simple, oh, this happened and that happened, but it's actually an incredibly difficult thing to do, especially in complex places and complex times like late 19th and early 20th century Ireland, where political organisations and ideas seem to have collapsed almost as quickly as new ones took their place. I think Roy's analysed change over time more persuasively than most, through painstaking research and a thorough mastery of social, political, and cultural history. There is no substitute for serious archival research, as he taught us all, and it shows in his work. I was blown away as an undergraduate the first time I'd heard of his work in Australia when I wasn't an Irish historian. I read Modern Ireland, and I hadn't ever read anything like it, and partly because of the way that those changes across time were linked by ideas as well as material reality, and by ideas that emerged from outside Ireland as well as those which emerged from within it. My own subsequent research in politics has been deeply indebted to latter works, especially the essays in Paddy and Mr. Punch, which for me demonstrate some of his key attributes: his questioning of Irish exceptionalism in particular, but also his keen understanding of how Ireland shaped British and UK politics and culture rather than merely being shaped by them. Some Irish historians have at times been accused of insularity, of not understanding what was going on outside Ireland, particularly in Britain. But I think that charge can actually go both ways, for sure. But Roy's understanding of Britain, Ireland, and their world contexts has informed his work in the broader field too. And it's something I think a lot of us who knew Roy and were taught by Roy or mentored by Roy have taken into our own work, understanding that we need to have that broader context. So much to say. I want to tell you just very briefly, Roy, that I still think, having reread things recently, I think Parnell and the Churchill biographies are your best works. I still go back to them. They're so good because Roy is obviously a wonderful writer. Writing about the lives of 2 remarkable men who are also very quotable doesn't hurt either. But their brilliance, I think, is primarily a product of his expertise in both the history of Ireland and Britain and a knowledge of political structures and processes, as well of course, his exceptional ability to tell life stories which transcend the biographies of their subjects. And this takes me to my final point, and I think it's probably in some ways the most important. I think unusually for an Irish historian, and of course that's what Roy is mostly known for, and for most historians really, his work has been read and appreciated by non-specialists in the field, by people who simply like to read interesting books and articles about modern history and culture. And also by historians who don't work on Ireland and don't know much about Ireland. It appears on reading lists well beyond Irish history courses. And we all know that he's ranged across the genres with ease. I think, though, what's sometimes missed is the exceptionally high regard in which he is held by his peers, particularly obviously by Irish historians, but by historians in other fields as well. They've honoured him with pretty much every accolade going in his field, in our field and beyond. As one contributor to the Feshrift said, Roy Foster is a world-class historian who just happens to write about Ireland. So many people have said to me that editing the Feshrift, in fact, somebody said it just before over drinks, must have been incredibly difficult as there were so many contributors to consider and to chivvy along at times. In fact, it was pretty easy, apart from the bibliography, because the enthusiasm for the project from the contributors was, was overwhelming, really. They were all so pleased to be part of it. And they weren't the only ones. These sorts of collections, it can be difficult to publish these sorts of collections because most presses don't like to publish them, especially university presses, for all sorts of reasons. But a collection for Roy Foster proved to be an exception. Our editor at Oxford University Press told me that OUP would only publish a Feshrift for scholars of the highest international calibre and of scholars who'd made a manifest contribution to the press and to Oxford. And of course, he accepted my proposal for Roy's immediately and with great enthusiasm. The readers' reports, which I might show you one day if you'd like to see them, were written by extremely eminent, but not Irish historians, and they also agreed that this project must and should go ahead. And OUP really worked hard to get it done quickly and to the standard that it deserved. Now, we're all here because we know how influential and wonderful Roy's work has been, and probably because reading it over the years has had an impact on the way that we all understand aspects of culture and politics. But I'm sure that we're also here because Roy always has interesting things to say about history, culture, the world, everything in between. So it's now my pleasure to hand over to Roy Foster and to Fintan O'Toole, who'll be discussing Roy's career, his contribution to Irish historical study, reflections on where we stand, and so much more.
Good evening, everybody. I trust you can hear me okay. What a pleasure it is to be able to do this. There's a long-standing Irish habit of suggesting things over dinner after the second bottle of wine, which then evaporate completely by dawn the following morning. And I remember having a discussion with Patrick and Colin in Notre Dame about, you really should do an event to celebrate the work of Roy Foster. And kind of completely forgetting about it. and then within a very short period of time, the event was real. It was being planned. And this was a terrible shock to the Irish system, really, make it happen. A poet that I know both Roy and I deeply admire, the late Derek Mahan, has a wonderful poem in which he takes up Wittgenstein's famous dictum that the world is everything that is the case. And then Mahan twists that to say, yes, but the world is also everything that is the case imaginatively. And when I think about Roy's work, there are those two indistinguishable sides to it. There's the scholarly work of the historian in making us think about what is the case and what has been the case in relation to the Irish past. But also, I think that unique contribution of making us think about what is and has been the case imaginatively. For me, as a writer, I think one of Roy's greatest achievements is that his work is not just part of the thinking about the Irish past. It is part of our imaginative life as citizens, as people who try to understand that very difficult notion of what it means to belong to Irishness in all its complexity. I just thought, Roy, if you don't mind, it's terrible quoting one historian to another, but it's not about you, but it's I came across this recently. Norman Davies was writing, and he says that the task of the historian goes beyond the duty of tending the generalized memory. When a few events of the past are remembered pervasively to the exclusion of equally deserving subjects, there is a need for determined explorers to stray from the beaten track and to recover some of the less fashionable memory sites. It's akin to the work of the ecologists and environmentalists who care for endangered species. And it struck me as sort of speaking to a lot of what you've done. I mean, do you think that analogy between what a historian should do and the ecologist who has to think about an ecosystem rather than simply the big beasts that survive the process of evolution might actually be some way of thinking about the task of the historian?
I think that's very acute. I think the ecosystem idea is good. And I noticed Davis uses the word memory as well.
Yeah.
Which increasingly has trenched into history. Yeah. We used to think of memory as something that was abstracted, different, qualitatively different from history, from things that happen. Now we realize that memory is what constructs history. And Arno Mayer, the Princeton historian who died very recently, said that memory was immutable and that history could be changed and reified and revised. I think in some ways it's the other way around. I think memory is, there are as many memories as there are grains of sand in the world. You know, I think that memory and the way that we have colonized it and produced it and used it in Ireland is both a very liberating way to see history. Ian McBride, who's in this room, edited a marvelous collection on history and memory in Ireland, which made those points, and people are picking up on it now. But it also confuses and obscures a great deal. I think what history has to do is strip back and ask pretty basic questions. And that, I don't mean by saying that to be reductionist or to, you know, diss the subtleties and varieties and interpretations which we have to confront within what you call the ecosystem. But we also have to ask that basic question, when somebody makes a historical assertion, how do you know that? And that goes back to evidence. So I like the ecosystem idea. I like the idea that we're analyzing the habits of thought as well as the ascertainable facts.
Yes.
But I think the ascertainable facts are there as the bedrock. And the older I get, the more I feel that must not be lost sight of.
Absolutely. Can I take you back maybe to your own upbringing, your own, what sense of Irish memory do you think you inherited, both in terms of the broad sense of just being an Irish person, but also were you conscious of having a sort of being at an angle to that from your own background?
There was a certain angularity because I went to a Quaker school in provincial Ireland. We weren't Quakers ourselves, we were Church of Ireland. It was in a very interesting school called Newtown School, where a certain kind of anti-clerical Catholic sent their children there. I'm talking about the 1950s and 60s. as well as the Protestant community, and it was a boarding school, so people came from all over. I think one learned history in two ways there. We had a very brilliant history teacher called Eileen Webster, who taught us the kind of history that was in Carty's school books, but also taught us the other stories, and was very clear that there was an official received history that wasn't entirely adequate. And when I wrote her obituary many years later, I found that she had written articles for The Bell, that legendary magazine, in the 1940s. And one of the articles was a plea for a recognition that Irish history was not about virtuous and evil people, and that the idea that everyone Irish was good and everyone English was bad was something we had to get beyond. She wrote that, I think, in 1946 in this legendary liberal journal, which some people in this room will know. And I realized that, in fact, the idea that it was my generation historians who were working at the same time as me in the 70s and 80s, who were dubbed revisionists, it didn't all begin then. It began much further back in the 30s and 40s, and I had been lucky enough to be taught by somebody who was conscious of that.
Well, one of the strange things about public culture in Ireland, it seems to me, is that you had on the one side this extraordinarily potent single narrative of oppression and triumph and martyrdom and all those things, which held the space. I mean, it was dominant and it worked politically, and yet the imaginative arena, the one occupied by the playwrights, by the novelists, by the poets, was very different. I mean, it was one which in fact was always, I was just last year, I think one of the great theatrical events in Ireland was Druid's production of the O'Casey.
Of the O'Casey plays, yeah.
Dublin plays. So you just take those for example, just as an example, right? So the idea that on the 10th anniversary of the 1916 Rising, where you've had the Civil War, where one of the few things that militant nationalists who have now come into power have been, fighting each other, killing each other, but they could all agree that 1916 was great. And on the 10th anniversary, you have a national theatre which puts on a play saying, well, hold on a minute, what is this history? Whose history is it? For whom did this make a difference? I mean, all those kind of questions are being asked constantly in the imaginative arena. And I just wondered for you, as someone who has written so brilliantly about both, the facts of history, but also about the mentalities of history, and has paid so much attention to the cultural realm, do you think that was also something that was kind of feeding into your own sense of what the task might be?
Yes, I think your point about O'Casey is very good, because I think The Plough and the Stars is a foundational revisionist text.
Yeah.
And there were others at it too. I mean, I think Sean O'Fallon is one of the most important Irish historians, which may be surprising to those of you who think of him as a short story writer and a not very good novelist. But he, in his books like The Great O'Neill, he was scoping out another view of Irish history. And King of the Beggars, his great book on O'Connell. And it surprises me that his importance as a radical historian is not made more of. He's also unusual in that he stayed in Ireland to write these books. When you think of O'Casey, and indeed Beckett, and indeed Joyce, and indeed many other, loosely speaking, dissident writers who queried the accepted national narrative, they do it from offshore, very often from England or from France or eventually from America. To have people presenting uncomfortable ideas from a base within the island was unusual. And we know how that is. We know it's because of censorship and the power of the church and all you have written about in We Don't Know Ourselves. But it's there. It's there and it should be remembered.
Yeah. Were you always going to be a historian? I mean, it may seem a stupid question, but one of the things that will strike anybody who's aware of your work, I mean, is how deeply engaged you are with literature, with imaginative literature, imaginative writing. I mean, it seems like it might have been just as possible that you would have ended up as a literary critic, for example. I mean, how did that shape itself in terms of your own development?
The funny thing is that the road not taken was not one to literature. It was to economics, the dismal science. That's what I began doing in Trinity. It was the late 1960s. We thought that economics were the answer to everything. I thought economics would be a kind of sociology of history. Instead, it all turned out to be about maths. I stuck it for a week, changed to history. But I was never tempted to study literature as an academic subject. It was before the dead hand of theory arrived. But even so, I thought that I would get as much from reading what I wanted to read without having to study it in an academic format. And history had always been of great interest. I went to school in America for a year after Newtown, and I had a brilliant history teacher there, where it may have begun, because when I turned to history from economics, I never looked back.
At the same time, though, I'm fascinated by that sense that you felt you were getting what you needed from literature without having to study it formally. But it's been a crucial hinterland for your own historical writing. You know, obviously you've written about Yeats, you've written about Heaney most recently, of course, brilliantly. And is that something which was there from the start? Your sense that you could not really write about history without writing about how people imagine themselves, or how the shaping of images, of stories, is not just influencing our own images of the past, but is also, of course, influencing the images of the past that people in the past themselves have. You know, that sort of ability to occupy that territory. Was that something that came naturally to you, do you think?
It seemed part of the deal. It seemed part of what you had to do. I think there was a moment in writing history as well, and this would apply to the 70s when I began to be a historian, where people began writing, historians began writing in a more upbeat, more self-conscious, more authoritative, more writing as auteur rather than writing as abstract, dry as dust recorders. The people who taught me, people like the great Keough Moody, wrote history far less attractively than they spoke about history. They were trying to remove themselves from the narrative. What was happening in the 70s when I began reading historians like Theodore Zeldin, Eugene Genovese, E.P. Thompson, and yes, certainly Eric Hobsbawm, whom Senja mentioned, I realized that you could write history in a personal way with a certain flavor to it. And I remember when Eric Hobsbawm retired from our department at Birkbeck, we had a thing for him, and we all said nice things about his work. And at the end, he said in his wonderfully ironic Olympian way that he was very glad to sit and listen to all this, and he thought his work would last. Not, he said, because it's right, though I know it is right. He was Marxist, after all. But because I went to a great deal of trouble to teach myself to write well. And I never forgot that, because from this person who was seen by the world as a flinty, hardline Marxist, which, by the way, he wasn't really. But for him, the style and the literature that he was embodying in the books he wrote, especially the great tetralogy, ending with the Age of Extremes. He was writing as a writer as well as a historian. And I think that was something that I learned from him and from others. And there is an argument that if you are allowing the auteur side of your writing personality to take over, you are obscuring what I called earlier the ascertainable social facts. So it is a kind of tension.
Yeah.
I think it's a tension worth exploring and worth holding in the balance.
Yes, yes. I mean, the other tension, I suppose, which seems to sit over the whole area of history writing, is because what's implied in writing well is not just a matter of style. Right? It's also a matter of having a relationship to a reader beyond the academic sphere. Yeah. So it's about saying, okay, the historian is a public figure. He or she may choose that or not, but it doesn't really matter what they choose. That's the nature of writing well about history, is that it will function in the public realm. That then leaves us open to the idea that the historian writes for the public. And of course, the public may have very different ideas about what they want their history to be. And there's also that tension. And some historians, we'll leave the names aside, but retreat from that into saying, no, it's a scientific discipline.
Yes.
It's only about the facts. And sort of, in a sense, building academic walls around it to say, actually, the way to protect the integrity of history from this pressure of the public to have a history that they can consume happily is to make it more and more and more of a specialized academic discipline. So I'm just fascinated by your capacity over time to sail your very narrow little boat between this whirlpool on the one side and this monster on the other side, where those two temptations are very potent. I just wonder how you feel you navigated that.
I'm not sure it's for me to say, Fintan. I'm very glad you see it in those terms. And you're dead right that that is an issue. But you just do what you can. And I think avoiding ex cathedra pronouncements, keeping the sense of you have to know, again, that question, how do you know that?
Yeah.
You have to keep that in focus all the time. But the other thing, and again, back to Senya's remarks about the Festschrift, which she so kindly edited for me, and the marvelous contributions in it from many of the people I've taught. The theme of that is that you don't know what the future is going to be. And I wrote in a book called The Irish Story that the best history is written when you realize that people acted in expectation of a future that never happens. Yeah. Which was an idea that I had in fact lifted from the wonderful last sentence of Yeats's first autobiography, Reveries Over Childhood and Youth, where he says that in the end, finishing the book, he looks back on his childhood and the worry he has brought parents and friends and lovers, and that he realizes that all life weighed in the scales of my own life is a preparation for something that never happens. Terrific insight. And it's that kind of openness and doubt and the idea that people are acting in a complete illusion, but a necessary illusion, that they know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
That, I think, opens up possibilities of writing the kind of history I've tried to write.
And isn't that where the humanity of history lies, is in not imposing on the past our knowledge of how it turned out, which is very difficult to do, isn't it? Because, of course, we do know how it turned out. But
that is the exact point. And that's where what I'd call the ex cathedra approach has to be fought against.
Yeah.
I suppose when I wrote Vivid Faces, what I was trying to do was restore the lives of people who really thought they knew what was going to happen.
Yes.
And who made a revolution and then saw it not produce the utopia they expected that it would. And for people like me who were young in the 1960s, this was a very vivid and rather plangent recognition.
Yes. I just want to ask you about storytelling, which is, I suppose, part of this too. In one of the essays you mentioned in parenthesis, referring to your wonderful book, Modern Ireland, I found myself, when I set out to write a general treatment of Irish history, intended to break out of genre, and ended by adhering much more closely than I realized to the story form. So what you were seem to be suggesting was that you started that book thinking, I'm going to not tell the story of Ireland, which of course you've written this magnificent essay about. It's not going to be beholden to this narrative form. It's going to be a new kind of genre, and it's not.
We're back to the illusions of youth. I'll tell you exactly how it was when I sat down to write Modern Ireland in the 1980s. I'd been very influenced by the French historian of France, Theodore Zeldin, who had been commissioned to write the volumes covering France in the Oxford History of Histories kind of thing, where Raymond Carr did a great volume of Spain and so forth. And I think to OUP's slight horror, Zeldin produced 2 volumes, one called France, whatever the dates were, 1800 to 1870, Ambition, Love and Politics. And then volume 2 was called France, 1800, whatever, Intellect, Taste and Anxiety. And what his OUP commissioners felt looking at these bizarre titles, I can't imagine. But those books electrified me because he was writing about how people experienced life instead of war and the conduct of public affairs in the great Gibbonian phrase. Yeah. He was looking at the actual lived experience of a small town pharmacist in the Languedoc or a farmer somewhere else. So it was building on the work, I suppose, books like Montagu, those books that looked at unusual experience of small forgotten people. Yeah. But Zeldin built it into a great panorama of 19th century France. And I thought, how wonderful to do that for Ireland. But of course, there are not the materials. You can't excavate the life of an obscure pharmacist in Clonmel in the way that you can in, let's say, Bourg. And also it did seem to me that the more I tried to write about Irish history in the longue durée and in a wide scope, and I was settling down to do it in the 80s, the more I felt that what was needed was, yes, to tell the story of Ireland, but to tell it full of open-ended and uncertain futures. And as you know, that book is constructed in that way.
Yeah.
I remember one review of it by a rather acidic historian called Michael Bentley said it wasn't a history, it was a collection of essays, giving sign of the brilliant essayist that he has never quite become. Terrible way these things you remember. But it was a rather essayistic approach rather than, you know, the great juggernaut of time moving inexorably forward.
Yeah. Looking back, how much pressure of the times, of the very fraught wars that were going on in relation to the uses of Irish history? Because, you know, the last person needs to be told that Irish history is not and never has been innocent in terms of its reception. Right. How much influence and pressure was there on that book from, you know, the horrific events that were unfolding? I think it's important for us to remember now how desperate the 1980s seemed. You know, the initial horrors of the Troubles in Northern Ireland had happened. There was initially a sense that this is so terrible it can't go on, and from my own memory, like by the 80s, there's a sense that it's already gone on a very long time, and there is no process. There's no apparent future. So the very idea in that book of the openness of history, looking back on it now, you know, although the book was kind of criticized for being taking the trauma out of Irish history and all those kind of things, but actually it's a very engaged book in relation to what history is and what its possibilities might be. But do you think, looking back, that all those things were in your mind at the time, or were you trying to keep them out?
I was trying to keep some of them out. One of the reasons why there was such visceral, vituperative combat going on in the world of writing history at that time was that there was a feeling that books like that, and books like Keough-Naughton's studies of normal Irish life in the 19th century, Vincent Comerford's work on the Fenian movement, which he saw as a kind of harmless pastime, because life in Ireland was so boring, people had to do something. I mean, these rather subversive opinions were taken as offensive because of the seriousness, I think, of what was going on in Anglo-Irish relations, because of the horrors in the North. And it was considered that not to write history that stuck it to the Brits was to fail in the duty of the historian. I put that very crudely, but a lot of the rhetoric of the time, as you well know, Fintan, was very crude. I think now we were all subliminally or consciously reacting against what the tragedy of the North was imposing on us in terms of historical interpretation. I think I would now say much more specifically that we were writing in reaction to that. And I say we because people like my old friend Marianne Elliott, who's here tonight, Vincent Comerford, the great David Fitzpatrick, now alas no longer with us, who were writing against the idea that you had to write in a certain kind of way because you were writing at a time of historical and political crisis. You had to combat that idea. That's not to say, and Marianne's book on the Catholics of Northern Ireland is a very wonderful example of this. It's not to say that you weren't to face up to these issues. It's that you were not to write about them in a moralizing or party-pre way. And I think by and large that faith was kept.
One of the things that's sort of obvious in a lot of the essays is an unusual, well, unusual for a historian, an unusual skepticism about the usefulness of history in the present. You remark somewhere that I think you say the politician who came closest perhaps to reconciling Ireland and Britain was Parnell, who was the one who knew least about Irish history.
Exactly.
Could you just maybe unpack that a little bit? I mean, as to what you meant by that and whether you've changed your mind about it over time.
It's a very complex question. Senja again mentioned my other early book. I wrote a book about Parnell. I wrote a book about Lord Randolph Churchill, Winston's father, who played a powerful part in Irish history and a very damaging part when he encouraged Ulster to resist Home Rule, but who at the same time knew far more about Ireland than anyone else in the Tory party of his day, who loved Ireland, who spent Christmases there, some of whose best friends were clever Irish Tory lawyers from whom he learned a rather cynical but very well-informed angle on what was happening in Ireland. And it did seem to me that it was interesting that the person who had done, in the received version, most damage to the advance of Irish nationalism, or the peaceful part severance or autonomy of Ireland, that Home Rule, which I think most people would agree was the answer that was there for the grasping and wasn't taken because of political opportunists like Randolph Churchill. It's fascinating to me that people could know as much as he did about Ireland and bring his influence to bear in the way he did. So that's one side of the equation. The other was Parnell, who was spectacularly ignorant of history, which meant it didn't get in his way when he tactically hitched the land war to the Home Rule issue and very nearly brought about a resolution of some of the most intractable questions in Irish history, and did, I think, in the terms of the land issue. Because, as again, a wonderful quote that I came across when I was researching Vivid Faces, the realization among several of the not so revolutionary revolutionaries that, thank God we haven't got the land problem to deal with. If we had that, if we still had the land revolution to deal with as well as the political revolution, things could have got really serious. But the land revolution was solved by the British taxpayer over the decades before the real revolution. And that's one reason why what emerged was the highly conservative petit bourgeois country that Ireland was and to a certain extent is.
Yes. I mean, it may be the same question, but in a way, but you, and possibly from the same essay, you quoted the wonderful Edna Longley, who I think we both greatly admire, who in 1998, or around the time of the Belfast Agreement, Edna wrote, I think in the Belfast Telegraph, she suggested that the next monument that should be built in Ireland was a monument to amnesia, and that we should then forget where we put it. You suggested, I think you finished one of the essays saying, should we go as far as to follow the suggestion that the next commemoration might take the form of raising a monument to amnesia and forgetting where we put it? Not entirely, you say. As a historian, I have to be rather shocked by the idea, but as an Irishman, I am rather attracted to it. And I'm just interested in that tension. That, of course, as a historian, it's not in your professional interest for amnesia to become the reigning goddess of any particular culture, not least the Irish one. But this idea that as an Irishman, as a member of that sort of very wide thing called the Irish public realm, this idea that perhaps amnesia might sometimes be useful to us. How do you deal with that contradiction? Because you end the essay by leaving open this contradiction.
Well, there's reasons for that. Yeah, it's a constant tension. Amnesia, David Fitzpatrick didn't like the word amnesia. He said when people talked about amnesia in Irish history, they really meant aphasia.
Yeah.
An inability to speak of something.
Yeah.
Rather than a determination to forget it.
Yeah.
Because you're remembering it all the time. But there are some things you don't articulate.
Yeah.
And life is easier if there are, as we all know in our personal lives as well, if there are certain things you don't go there. But in a way, it's the historian's job to keep going there.
Yeah.
But it makes life, and I'm thinking of the vituperation and the high octane of those arguments about revisionism back in the 80s and 90s. It would have been easier to have a quiet life, but it's not really an option if you're going to start digging around.
Yeah. Because it's happening again. I mean, one of the extraordinary and depressing aspects of the peace process is that we've had various phases at which there's been agreement by both governments, all parties. We're going to have, say, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We're going to have processes which deal with this recent past, which is a receding past, thankfully, and a complete unwillingness and inability to do it.
Yeah.
And I wonder, we had the very difficult and unfortunate episode of Boston College. Can be criticized maybe for trying to do this, but the oral history projects, which went awry when the American courts had certain things to say about those things. But this is a very live question. It's not an abstract one about forgetting and remembering. And I wonder, from your perspective of all those years of writing Irish history, what you feel about the history of the Troubles, the history of Irish violence since 1968, which is still weirdly unarticulated. And again, it's a political issue, obviously. Sinn Féin, for example, may well be in government on both sides of the border, and maybe by the end of this year, does not want to remember certain things, or does not want to allow certain things to be spoken about, and equally on the loyalist side, there's a huge amount of reluctance to talk about certain things. The British government has just recently put through legislation stopping even inquests, into deaths. So I just wonder how you feel about all that from your own perspective.
I think the repressed will return. I'm old-fashioned, Freudian enough to believe in that. I think you can't damp down history. Guy Biner, a historian I admire greatly, has written about social memory in this way.
Yeah.
And how things heave to the surface no matter what, and the stratagems that we employ to try and keep them down. I think the history of the Troubles, I'd be very interested to see how it is written, when it is written, because I agree with you, it's not been written. I mean, I read, you read, we all read dozens of books about the Troubles. If we sit on committees that, like the European Prize, which I chair, the books on the Troubles that come tumbling out year after year seem to get us no nearer, I think. I can think of very few titles that have got us near what that terrible episode actually meant.
Yeah.
It may be that we need to be writing about it in a completely new way.
Yeah.
It may be that it will be testimonies. It may be that it will be poetry that, as in the case of Caelan McConnell or Michael Longley or absolutely Seamus Heaney, as you know better than anyone, that has in a sense made sense of the antipathies and violence and hope for reconciliation in a way that no historian has actually managed to do. It may be that history will be written about from a much more personal angle, as you did in We Don't Know Ourselves, patterning your own life against the larger history, or as the great Annie Arnaud has done in the years, which my daughter, who has an eye for the coming vogue, gave me years ago. And I was stunned by the way that she patterned historical change, which is what interests all of us, against personal consciousness. Nobody's done that for Northern Ireland, but somebody might.
Yes.
But I think rather than institutional history, which is so confined by exactly the kind of restrictions that you're mentioning, rather than institutional history, it'll probably be a new kind of way of writing history that evaluates and illuminates and even makes sense of 30 years of horror.
Very striking. I think that you could make a very broad argument that you start with poetry and then the novel begins to be able to deal with it. Maybe we're in the phase now when the novel can deal with the Troubles, and maybe we'll move on to when the historians can deal with it, you know. I want to ask you about biography, because in some ways, intellectually with postmodernism and with critical theory, biography became very unfashionable. And I think perhaps, I don't know if this is true, that for within the history discipline, slightly suspect, you know, because it's a populist form. It's a form which is sort of there for the general reader as well. And of course, as well as being a great historian, you are a great biographer. I mean, you've written 4 extraordinary books which are based on the lives of individuals. You said in one of the essays that you thought there was something particularly Irish about this tendency to want to see the macrocosm in the microcosm of the individual life, or maybe the other way around, to see the individual life as somehow representative of the times and the place. How in writing biography have you kept that balance between the microcosm and the macrocosm?
Well, I think I've written very different kinds of biographies.
Yeah.
The Parnell biography was, I was still in my junior level Marxisant approach to things, and I thought that context explained everything. Economics explained most things. I would find this enigma figure who has always been seen as somebody who gave up a life of privilege to lead Irish nationalism. And by finding out that he was in fact a totally on his uppers impoverished Anglo-Irish gent who never made money out of anything except politics, I would make a certain sense of his life. To a certain extent, I think I did that. But again, rather as with being captured by the narrative flow of modern Ireland, I was captured by personal aspects of his life, which aren't ascribable just to economic circumstances. The Randolph Churchill book was a biography, but somebody whom I wanted to examine as a locus classicus of a completely political animal. I've touched on this a few minutes ago. And I was also teaching a course on Victorian studies, which involved Victorian political novels at the time. So I was patterning his life against somebody from a novel by Trollope or George Meredith, and using epigraphs from that great slew of fiction, which I love, to pattern his life against it. I still think it's an interesting thing to have done, but there may be something slightly mechanistic in it. Yeats was completely different, because Yeats was like having the keys to a kingdom. You know, it was, I had unrestricted access to marvelous family archives. I visited 22, 24 maybe major archives in the States. I had more material than you could dream of, but I had to impose a shape on it. And the shape I chose was, as I say in the introduction to that book, not concentrating on what Yeats wrote, but on what he did. And the work sort of built up as his life progressed. And in the second volume, I allowed myself write much more about the work in a almost literary critical way than I had allowed myself in the first volume. But the idea was, and his daughter Anne Yates said to me, it was the nicest thing anyone said, I think, that reading it was like growing up with her father and looking over his shoulder. And that is exactly the kind of creation I wanted to make. Vivid Faces, the fourth biography, if you like, is different again because it's a group biography. And it was an attempt to reclaim the lives of people who had been generally presented as heroic saints and martyrs, and who were heroic in many ways, but many of them were not saints, and not all of them were martyred. And odd key quotes from that amazing generation of revolutionaries gave me signals of how to go forward. One where I found Bulmer Hobson, Quaker revolutionary incidentally, writing to a friend in the 1950s, I wonder if anyone has as much fun nowadays as we did. And I thought I'd like to put the fun back in fundamentalism. And reading these people's diaries to find out that they read Freud, they had interesting sex lives, they discussed sex outside marriage. They were young people thinking that they were changing the world. And that again gave me an angle, a way in.
Do you think that wonderful book was also a kind of reconciliation for you? You, by force of circumstance and probably by, intellectual and temperamental inclination, you were involved in a kind of combative relationship with the myths of Irish nationalism, which I think had an enormously beneficial effect actually in terms of Irish history. But that doing that book, and the sheer human sympathy that shines out from that book, the vividness of those faces. To me, reading it was really moving for the book in itself, but also a sense of some kind of circle being closed, where you were kind of coming back somehow to.
You're asking, was it an act of expiation?
Not quite, no, but maybe of reconciliation. Yeah.
It was. There's a certain expiation in that. One thing that I didn't do well in modern Ireland was the history of women.
Yeah.
And historians like Senya have revolutionized that, and we now see Irish history in a gendered way, in a completely different case. When I was writing my sources for modern Ireland in the early 80s, the stuff wasn't really there. There were a couple of pioneer scholars, but it was not easy to plumb female experience in the way that you could the experience of men, especially prominent men. So when I wrote Vivid Faces, I was very struck by the agency of women, like the Ryan sisters, like Rosamund Jacob, like Helena Maloney. And I wanted to plug them fully into the story. So there was a certain expiation there. The question you're asking, Fintan, is whether I was making up with the heroes of 1916, whom I had said, I mean, I did refer in Modern Ireland to some of Pearse's statements as sinister gibberish, and I did get into trouble for that. Returning to Pearse and his generation, not Pearse so much personally, but more the people like Liam de Rochela, Wilmer Hobson, less canonical figures. I did find a deep sympathy with them and their ideals. I did find them very touching in some ways, reading their diaries. I found them very engaging, where Liam de Rochela, about 10 years after the revolution, writes that he no longer worries very much about people he doesn't disagree with. They just make him laugh. And I thought part of being a youthful revolutionary in Ireland was A, trying to change the world, but B, realizing that there are things you can't change. And this made them a very engaging and rather simpatico bunch of people. I chose them quite carefully, but but the choice of them was also dictated by what records they had left behind. So in a sense, it's a sort of self-selecting thing. I wanted to work from before hindsight. I wanted to work from diaries and letters, not so much from recollections. I mean, the great wealth of information in the Bureau of Military History records is amazing and has revolutionized our understanding, but it is all recollected history.
Yeah.
And I think one must never forget that. I was trying to get behind hindsight.
Yeah. The final question I want to ask you about is, I mean, the project you've been engaged with for so long, I mean, it's a crude way of putting it, but it has been a pluralistic project. I mean, it has been the pluralization of Ireland's sense of itself. And it's been a remarkably influential enterprise. You know, and I'm not saying you're the only person who's been engaged in it, but you have been central to it. And it seems to me we've had an extraordinary kind of testing of this really over the last decade. As you probably are aware, we've been through the decade of centenaries. I don't know if anybody has ever, any other country has officially had a decade of centenaries, you know. But because from 1912, 1913, you know, you've had a major event that you've had to deal with. And I remember at the start of this process, even in, say, in 2012, 2011, discussions about this was very, very fearful. I mean, really, people were pretty scared, which is if you start opening it up again, it's just going to start the whole problem. You know, it's just going to feed back into it. And it seems to me, I mean, some people here may disagree with this, but that by and large, it's actually been a very successful process. That actually it's been a process which democratized the history, the making available of so many of those witness accounts, the pension records which have come on stream, but also the sort of engagements, the artistic engagements, the community engagements. There's been, you know, a lot of work being done on it at sort of local levels, and the thrust of most of it has been towards an acceptance, firstly, of the tragic nature of history. You know, that actually, you know, people get stuck in situations where they can do no other than they do, even if it turns out to be deeply wrong. But also of the sense that there are multiple histories actually that you know, you have to deal with those. And it does seem to me to be a remarkable example of the influence of historians in actually deepening and complicating and opening up for a public its broader sense of itself. Am I being too optimistic in thinking that?
No, I share your optimism, especially looking at previous commemorative jamborees. I think the mere fact that what we were commemorating was in the more recent past, it wasn't like the centenary or the bicentenary of 1798, for instance, which was so far in the distant past that it could be, I thought, rather unwisely manipulated by some political elements to chime nicely in with the Good Friday, the oncoming Good Friday Agreement. Europe, you know, the French are in the Bay again. All that kind of rather, I think, voodoo approach to how to commemorate a moment of history for present purposes. Some of us wrote unhelpfully about that, and I don't regret my own unhelpful remarks about it at the time. I think by the time the decade of commemorations came along, we were more sophisticated, more careful. I think the government deserves great credit for the way they did liaise with historians, some of them in this room, who I think helped project a far more pluralist, than your word, approach to Irish experience, which was following in a way the direction history had been going in, professional history and to a certain extent popular history over the previous 20, 30 years. So I think in a sense, I would agree exactly with what you say. The real dodgy question was when the Civil War came up.
Yeah.
And it was in a sense commemorated by Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael going into coalition.
Yes.
Which had a perfect symmetry about it. But I would like to say that, I'd like to say also actually that I think maybe it's because we're a small country with intimate relationships, but the connections between Irish government, civil servants, politicians, diplomats, and I'm very happy to see the ambassador here tonight, with culture in the largest form is very inspiring. I think the way that Irish diplomats all over the world involve themselves with the transmission of Irish culture, the celebration of Irish culture, is very unlike what happens in, I think, the British diplomatic corps. And I think it's very inspirational. And it was happening, I think, behind the scenes, in the very delicate maneuverings about how to commemorate what was essentially 10 years of upheaval, inspirational, heroic actions, but also horrific actions and terrible memories and things that amnesia or aphasia even can't cover up, especially when it came to the Civil War. But we seem to have accomplished that. And so I'm an optimist like you in this, if not too much else.
Well, Roy rightly paid tribute to government and diplomats and the cultural sphere in relation to all of this, but we have to pay tribute to historians and we have to pay tribute to Roy's centrality as a historian, as a writer, as a public figure to that process. It matters what great historians do. It matters how great writers write. And I think Roy is not just being a great historian and a great writer, but also, I was going to embarrass him and say great patriot, but I think he would probably just not talk to me ever again if I said it. But a great public citizen. I think Ireland's been hugely fortunate to have someone of his articulacy, of his brilliance, but also of his care, the passion, the care in both senses. Passion of really the energy of engagement, but the care of, as you started with, how do you know this happened? Taking things back to that rigor, and that combination of caring in both senses, I think, is what has characterized his work, and what has made us fortunate indeed to be his contemporaries. Thank you very much, Roy.
Thank you both very, very much for that. I'm here just to referee. So I'm opening the floor to questions. I'm sure you all have plenty. We have someone here with a microphone, so please put your hand up. Oh, there's another one at the back. Perfect. I was wondering how you'd get through. So please feel free to ask questions. We don't have very long. We only have about 10 minutes, so please try to keep them fairly brief.
Marion Elliott. I would just like to pay tribute to Roy, because we kind of arrived on the scene over in England more or less at the same time. We became firm friends, meeting at interviews that he was more successful at than I was. But that was way back in 1974. And I just want to pay tribute to Roy, for we've heard a lot about his writing of Irish history. Roy has always been an amazing stylist. You picked it up, Fintan. A model of any kind of historian whose work can be read by any member of the public who could read. Nowadays in universities, public history, so-called, is being promoted. But Roy was writing that from the word go, and it was very, very unusual at the time. The second thing I want to say is that because Roy and I, from the word go, developed an amazing creative friendship. And also we were being attacked at the same time. And it was actually, you know, we used to compare the death threats that we were getting. Yeah, we were young, you know, we were only writing history. And historians of other countries besides Ireland were surprised at this. You know, they envied the fact, you know, that people cared a lot about history in Ireland, but they didn't quite recognize how difficult it was to be at the end of that. Now, Roy really did transform also the reception of Irish history in this country. It wasn't really very well known at all. I mean, I remember when we first met and I said, I am so grateful to have somebody else in this country to talk Irish history to, because it really wasn't being, and just look now, it's taught in every Irish university. And just lastly, Roy, and I don't think I'd heard this from you before, that when you came over here, the importance of the way French historians were writing. And that's absolutely true, because it was one of the things I noticed as well. We were so hung up on the past in Ireland. You know, in France, you know, they'd had their revolution, you know, nearly the same time that we'd had 1798. But they didn't seem to be tearing themselves apart quite the way that we were. And I think what you talked about very well tonight was that they were looking at emotions, they were looking at how ordinary people behaved in the past. And we somehow were still in Ireland being caught with these kind of great, supposedly nationalistic themes. And in many ways, I'm sure you were the same, Roy, it took a while to recognize that, you know, being outside Ireland,
Yeah.
we were able to kind of recognize a bit more. So I will just finish up by, again, paying tribute to Roy and thanking him for the most wonderful, 40 years of creative friendship and transforming the reception of Irish history in this country. So.
Thank you, Marianne.
Well, firstly, thank you, Dr. Foster. I wouldn't have passed my exams without your books. So I wanted to ask you, touch briefly there on popular history. And I noticed over Christmas, my family were watching Belfast. It was the first time I'd ever seen depictions of Protestants in the cultural depictions of Northern Ireland. I just wanted to get your views on the importance of film and TV in the popular understanding of history and how helpful or unhelpful it is, in particularly with regards to the Troubles.
That's a good question and a difficult one. I think it can be very illuminating if it's done right. You mean the creative interpretation in drama and so forth about, yeah, and I think some of the key things that we've looked at, I mentioned the Ewart Biggs Prize, which rewards a work that increases understanding between Britain and Ireland, or Ireland North and South. And over the many years we've been doing that, we look very regularly at television programs, plays, poetry sometimes. And as I said at an earlier point in my discussion with Fintan, in some ways that can be more illuminating, especially when you're trying to understand something outside your own personal experience than everyday history can be. On the other hand, you can, of course, use drama to obscure points rather than to illuminate them, and that is not unknown either. But the best of drama that has illuminated the way people think in the past, I think of Frank McGuinness's Observe the Sons of Ulster, Martin Towards the Sun, or Sebastian Barry's The Steward of Christendom. The best of drama can illuminate an other experience to the one you thought you knew about. Both those plays are classic instances of taking a forgotten or an unattended aspect of history affecting Irish history, North and South, and illuminating it in a very powerful and moving way. So I think drama especially, but also poetry, has to be built into this.
I want to ask you about writing Irish history from a cosmopolitan point of view. It might be partly about writing Irish history while being based in Britain, and how you have found that subject to be received while practicing Irish history whilst being in a major English institution.
Well, as my old friend and colleague Marianne Elliott said, things have changed. When we got our first jobs in this larger island, after having failed to get jobs in the smaller island, it was the mid-1970s and Irish history was not on the agenda. We both, Marianne and I, had jobs teaching British history. My chair in London University was a chair of British history. But partly because, I think, of the events in Northern Ireland, Irish history became more fashionable, I have to use the word. And the work of people, several of them in this room, like Charles Townsend, who brought Irish history into the center of the British historical world, was, I think, a function not only of its intrinsic interest, and I have to say that I think Irish history is one of the most interesting national histories you could find, but also because of its perceived relevance to the immediate horrors of what was going on in Northern Ireland. We had to understand them from a historical framework, and this was one way in which one sold to the apparatchiks how to get a special or further subject on Irish history onto the syllabus. There still remains only one endowed chair of Irish history in Britain, permanently endowed, which is the one at Oxford that I held and that Ian McBride now holds. And I wish there were more. But there is the Institute of Irish Studies at Liverpool. There are strong centres of Irish history in various other universities, notably Aberdeen. And so the word has spread. But the other part of your question, as I understand it, is rather interesting, which is whether one thinks rather differently about Irish history, studying it from outside the island. And I think that's absolutely right. I think it's a plus. My old mentor, Theodore Moody, who always had an eye for a very brilliant self-exculpating argument, used to frequently tell me that I should thank him very much for not giving me a job in the Trinity Department, Trinity History Department in 1974, when I failed to be appointed to a job that I very much wanted, because he said it would have been far better for me to go and study in England, to teach in England, to learn new things, to meet new people. This I can now see, though it didn't seem like that in 1974. But I think that I mentioned the kind of, and Marianne has just mentioned it too, the kind of history we were reading. I mentioned Zeldin in France, Eugene Genovese on the world the slaves made in the southern states of America, E.P. Thompson's extraordinary book, The Making of the English Working Class. One read these creative approaches to writing the history of experience in a new way, and some of us tried to project that back on Ireland. Easier to do it when you're teaching different subjects in another country.
You talked a lot about how important writing is, and I think it was one of your colleagues at his retirement party talked that he worked so hard on learning how to write well. I don't know if you could share with all of us how one becomes a good writer. Is it nature? Is it nurture? How does one develop and cultivate it? What tactics do you use? What advice have you given your students?
That's a tricky one.
Last question.
I think you do what the great historian of Victorian England, J.M. Young, said, you read until you hear the people talking. And that gets it. I can't put it better myself.